Hi, my name's Caden Marvik. At my college graduation dinner, my sister Irixie looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're worthless trash, Caden. You always have been, you always will be. Even with that useless computer science degree, you'll never amount to anything." The whole family nodded in agreement. I just sat there in silence. But 8 years later, I walked into the auction house and bought her dream $85 million Malibu estate with a single wire transfer. The same estate she'd been obsessing over in magazines since we were teenagers. The one she swore she'd own someday when she became a successful real estate mogul. What changed everything wasn't revenge or luck. It was what I discovered about my family's true nature and the empire they never saw me building in the shadows. But before I tell you that story, ask yourself this. What would you do if your own blood spent a decade convincing you that you were nothing, while you were secretly becoming everything? Let me show you how silence can be the loudest victory of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the affluent neighborhood of Thornbrook Heights outside Seattle, the Marvik family name meant something. My father, Owen Trellis, had built a successful chain of luxury car dealerships across the Pacific Northwest. My mother, Solara Grenthal, came from old money and never let anyone forget it. Their world revolved around country club memberships, charity galas, and maintaining appearances that screamed success and sophistication. Then there was my sister Irixie, 5 years older than me, who seemed to inherit every gene that mattered in our family. She was tall, confident, and had this magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. By the time she turned 16, she was already talking about her future real estate empire, flipping through Architectural Digest and pointing at oceanfront mansions she claimed she'd own someday. The Whitmore estate in Malibu was her particular obsession, a sprawling 15,000-square-foot masterpiece perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. She had torn out magazine pages featuring that property and pinned them to her bedroom wall like some people collect baseball cards. Irixie excelled at everything she touched. Valedictorian of her high school class, captain of the debate team, homecoming queen, and later graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a business degree. She moved to Los Angeles immediately after college and landed a position with Pemberton and Associates, one of the most prestigious real estate firms in Beverly Hills. Within 3 years, she was their top agent, selling multi-million-dollar properties to celebrities and tech moguls. And then there was me, Caden, the family disappointment. While Irixie commanded every room she entered, I preferred the quiet corner with my laptop, writing code and building small programs that nobody seemed to care about. My parents viewed my interest in computers as a phase, something I'd outgrow once I developed real ambitions like my sister. Family dinners were exercises in subtle and not-so-subtle comparisons. Irixie would regale everyone with stories of her latest seven-figure sale, while I'd mention a programming project I was working on, only to watch eyes glaze over with polite disinterest. The dynamic became even more pronounced during holidays and special occasions. Irixie would arrive in whatever luxury car she was driving that year, designer clothes, perfectly styled hair, always with some impressive story about her business conquests. I'd show up in my Honda Civic, usually wearing jeans and a hoodie, carrying my worn laptop bag. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially Irixie herself. Our extended family gatherings at my grandmother Lunara Feldren's estate in Bellevue were particularly brutal. The sprawling Tudor mansion would fill with aunts, uncles, and cousins, all successful professionals in their own right. Uncle Daryl Fenmark ran a construction company, Aunt Celine Thaurish was a prominent surgeon, and cousin Jonas Thalvin had just made partner at his law firm. They'd all gather in the grand living room with its cathedral ceilings and marble fireplace, sharing stories of professional achievements and financial milestones. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 22, still in college finishing my computer science degree. Irixie had just closed a deal on a $12 million home in Beverly Hills, and the entire family hung on her every word as she described the property's amenities. Smart home technology, infinity pool, wine cellar, the works. When the conversation eventually turned to me, I mentioned that I'd been working on a mobile app for inventory management. "Oh, Caden's still playing with his little computer games," Irixie said with that patronizing smile she'd perfected over the years. The room chuckled politely, And the subject quickly changed back to real achievements, real success, real careers. My parents, while not as openly dismissive as Irixie, had their own subtle ways of showing disappointment. My father would occasionally ask when I planned to join the real world and consider a career in sales or business management. My mother would suggest I take some business classes to round out my education. They never said I was worthless directly, but their body language and tone conveyed the message clearly enough. The pattern continued through college and beyond. Every family gathering became a showcase for Irixie's latest accomplishments, while my endeavors were treated as hobbies at best, failures at worst. She'd bought her first investment property, a condo in Santa Monica that she was renovating and flipping. I'd created a small app that helped local restaurants manage their delivery orders, but when I tried to explain it, my father just nodded absently and asked if I was making any money from it yet. The truth was, I wasn't making much money from anything in those days. After graduation, I was living in a studio apartment in the University District, working part-time at a tech support company while trying to develop my own software projects in my spare time. My salary barely covered rent and ramen noodles, a fact that Irixie never let me forget during her increasingly rare visits to Seattle. She'd show up in her leased BMW, wearing clothes that cost more than I made in a month, and survey my tiny apartment with barely concealed disgust. "This is what a computer science degree gets you," she'd say, gesturing at my second-hand furniture and makeshift desk setup. "Caden, you're 24 years old. When are you going to grow up and get a real job?" The worst part wasn't even the direct criticism. It was the way she'd talk about me to other people while I was right there in the room. During one family barbecue at our parents' house, I overheard her talking to our cousin Sandro Dramier, who was visiting from Portland with his new wife. "Poor Caden thinks he's going to be the next Bill Gates or something," she said, just loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. "He's been living in that tiny apartment for 2 years now, making minimum wage and pretending he's building the future. It's actually kind of sad." Sandro laughed uncomfortably. "Well, maybe something will work out for him." "Doubtful," Irixie replied. "He's never been realistic about his abilities. Some people are meant for big things, and others are meant to be tech support forever. Caden's in the second category, but he's too delusional to see it." That conversation haunted me for weeks afterward, not because it was particularly cruel by Irixie's standards, but because part of me wondered if she was right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I was wasting my life chasing impossible dreams while my sister built a real, tangible empire in the real estate world. But something inside me refused to give up. Late at night in my studio apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the glow of multiple monitors, I kept coding. I kept building. I kept believing that eventually I'd create something that mattered, something that would prove them all wrong. I just had no idea how spectacularly right that belief would turn out to be. The breaking point came at my college graduation dinner, a moment that should have been celebratory but instead became the most humiliating experience of my life up to that point. My parents had reserved a private dining room at Il Bistro Romano, an upscale Italian restaurant in downtown Seattle that was one of my mother's favorite places to see and be seen. The entire extended family was there, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all gathered supposedly to celebrate my achievement. I should have known something was off from the moment I walked into that private dining room. The seating arrangement had been carefully orchestrated, with me placed at the far end of the table, almost like an afterthought. Irixie, who had driven up from Los Angeles specifically for this dinner, commanded the center of attention as usual, regaling everyone with stories about her latest real estate conquests. She'd just closed escrow on a $18 million property in Malibu Hills, and the commission alone was more than most people made in 5 years. But that wasn't enough for her that night. She seemed determined to use my graduation dinner as yet another opportunity to establish the hierarchy between us, to make sure everyone understood who the real success story in the family was. "You know," she said as the appetizers arrived, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver what she considered wisdom, "I was just thinking about how different Caden and I turned out to be. Here I am, 29 years old, and I've already built a 7-figure real estate business. I own 3 properties, I drive a car that costs more than most people's houses, and I'm finally close to making an offer on my dream home." I took a deep breath and tried to explain my vision for the logistics optimization platform, how it could save companies millions of dollars by analyzing shipping routes and inventory patterns in real time. I talked about the machine learning algorithms I developed, the pilot program I was hoping to launch with a local distribution company, the potential for scaling the technology across multiple industries. But I could see their eyes glazing over as I spoke. This wasn't the kind of success they understood. There were no tangible assets, no impressive office buildings, no luxury cars to show for my work, just code, algorithms, and theoretical potential. When I finished, there was a moment of uncomfortable silence. Then Irixie set down her wine glass and looked directly at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't just dismissive or patronizing. It was cruel in a way that cut deeper than anything she'd ever said before. "Caden," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room, "I think it's time someone in this family told you the truth. You're worthless trash. You always have been, you always will be. Even with that useless computer science degree you just spent 4 years and God knows how much of mom and dad's money earning, you'll never amount to anything." She pulled out her phone and showed everyone the latest photos of the Whitmore estate, the same Malibu mansion she'd been obsessing over since we were teenagers. The property had recently come back on the market for $85 million, and she'd been working with investors to try to put together a consortium to purchase it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is it," she said, swiping through professional photos of infinity pools, wine cellars, and panoramic ocean views. "This is what I've been building toward my entire career. Whitmore Estate, 15,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, 3 acres of manicured gardens right on the Pacific Coast Highway. The previous owner was that tech mogul who sold his company to Google for $2 billion. The family passed her phone around the table, everyone appropriately impressed by the opulent photos. My grandmother examined the images with particular interest, nodding approvingly at the imported Italian marble and custom millwork. "It's stunning, darling," she said to Irixie, "and you think you'll be able to afford it soon?" "I'm putting together an investment group," Irixie explained. "Between my savings, my business partner's capital, and some private investors, we should be able to make a competitive offer within the next 6 months. The seller is motivated, and my connections in Malibu give me an inside track." This went on for 20 minutes, with Irixie holding court about her business acumen, her investment strategies, and her inevitable rise to the top of the luxury real estate world. Finally, almost as an afterthought, someone asked about my plans after graduation. "Well," I began, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice, "I've been working on a few different software projects. There's this inventory management system I designed that could really streamline operations for small businesses. And I've also been developing a platform that uses machine learning to optimize logistics networks." The polite smiles around the table were painful to watch. I could see in their faces that they had no idea what I was talking about, and worse, they didn't really care to understand. My father cleared his throat. "That sounds interesting, son, but what are your actual career plans? Are you going to apply to some of the big tech companies, or maybe consider business school?" Before I could answer, Irixie jumped in with that laugh she reserved for my most naive statements. "Dad, you don't understand. Caden thinks he's going to be an entrepreneur. He thinks he's going to build the next Facebook or something from his studio apartment." The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. I've tried to explain to him that the startup world is brutal, that 90% of new businesses fail within the first year, but he's convinced he's going to be the exception. My Uncle Daryl leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "What exactly are you trying to build, Caden?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands suddenly clammy as I gripped the edge of the table. But Irixie wasn't finished. "Look around this table," she continued, gesturing to our relatives. "Everyone here has built something real, something tangible, something that matters. Uncle Daryl employs 50 people in his construction company. Aunt Celine saves lives every day as a surgeon. Cousin Jonas represents clients who depend on him. Even our parents built a business empire that provides for dozens of families." She paused for effect, making sure she had everyone's complete attention before delivering the final blow. "But you? You sit in your pathetic little apartment, playing with code like it's a video game, pretending you're changing the world while you can barely afford to feed yourself. You're 22 years old, and you have nothing to show for your existence except delusions of grandeur and a degree in computer games." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the table, hoping for someone to defend me, to tell Irixie she'd gone too far. Instead, I saw nods of agreement, uncomfortable shifting, but no disagreement with her assessment. My father finally spoke up, but not to defend me. Irixie, that was a bit harsh, but perhaps you have a point. Caden, we've been patient with your interests, but maybe it is time to consider more practical options. My mother added, we just want you to be realistic about your future, dear. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling like I'd been publicly executed at what was supposed to be my own celebration dinner. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and artificial politeness, but Irixie's words echoed in my head like a mantra of failure. Worthless trash. You always have been, you always will be. I excused myself early, claiming I felt sick, which wasn't far from the truth. As I walked to my car in the restaurant's parking lot, I could hear laughter drifting from the private dining room through the open windows. They were having a wonderful time now that the family disappointment had left. That night, I sat in my studio apartment staring at my computer screen, Irixie's words playing on repeat in my mind. Part of me wanted to prove her wrong out of spite, but a larger part of me wondered if she was right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I should give up on my entrepreneurial dreams and just get a regular job like everyone expected. I went to bed that night not knowing that within 8 years I'd be writing a check for $85 million to buy the exact property Irixie had been fantasizing about. I had no idea that her cruelest words would become the fuel that powered the most spectacular success story of my generation. But first, I had to discover something that would change not just how I saw my family but how I saw myself. 6 months after that devastating graduation dinner, I was barely keeping my head above water. I'd found a job doing technical support for a mid-sized software company in Redmond, making just enough to cover my rent and groceries with maybe $50 left over each month for everything else. My dreams of entrepreneurship seemed more foolish with each passing day of mundane troubleshooting calls and password resets. The discovery that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. I was having lunch at Café Luna, a small coffee shop near the University of Washington, where I sometimes went to work on my personal projects. The Wi-Fi was reliable, the coffee was decent, and most importantly, it was cheap enough for my budget. I'd been there for about an hour, working on refining the machine learning algorithms for my logistics platform, when 2 men in expensive suits sat down at the table next to mine. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention to other customers, conversations, but something about their discussion caught my ear immediately. The Marvik deal is moving forward faster than expected, one of them said, pulling out a tablet and swiping through what looked like financial documents. The preliminary numbers look even better than our projections. My head snapped up. Marvik was my family name, and while it wasn't exactly uncommon, it was unusual enough that hearing it mentioned by 2 businessmen in a coffee shop definitely got my attention. How much are we talking about for the full acquisition? The second man asked, leaning forward and lowering his voice slightly. Owen's asking for $42 million for the entire dealership chain, the first man replied. But based on our analysis of the regional market and their customer database, we're prepared to go as high as $55 million if necessary. This acquisition gives us complete control of luxury auto sales across the Pacific Northwest. I nearly choked on my coffee. Owen Trellis was my father, and they were discussing selling his dealership business. But this was the first I'd heard about any sale, and the numbers they were throwing around were staggering. I'd always known my father's business was successful, but $55 million successful? The first man continued, the interesting thing is how they've structured their assets over the years. Very sophisticated tax planning, multiple LLCs, offshore accounts, trust funds for the family members. Owen's financial advisor clearly knows what he's doing. Trust funds? The second man asked. I didn't see that in the preliminary documentation. Yeah, apparently they set up education and development trusts for both of their offspring years ago. Standard wealthy family stuff. Ensuring the next generation has capital to start their own ventures, invest in properties, that sort of thing. The daughter's already been drawing from hers to finance her real estate business in Los Angeles. My blood turned to ice water. Trust funds? Irixie had been drawing money from a family trust to finance her real estate career? Suddenly, her rapid rise in the luxury property market made a lot more sense. I'd always wondered how she'd managed to afford her first investment property, her designer wardrobe, her expensive car. I'd assumed she was just extraordinarily successful at sales, but apparently, she'd had a significant financial head start that she'd never mentioned. What about the son? The second man asked, echoing the exact question that was screaming in my head. The first man shuffled through his papers for a moment. Caden Marvik, 23 years old, computer science degree. According to the trust documentation, he was supposed to gain access to his fund after college graduation, but there's a note here that says the distributions have been delayed pending career stabilization, whatever that means. How much are we talking about? The trusts were initially funded with $2 million each, but with investment growth over the years, they're now worth approximately $4.7 million apiece. I felt like the world had tilted sideways. $4.7 million. There was a trust fund with my name on it worth nearly $5 million. Money that had been growing for years while I ate ramen noodles and worried about making rent. Money that I'd never been told about. Money that could have changed my entire life trajectory. But according to what I'd just overheard, Irixie had been accessing her trust fund for years to build her real estate empire, while mine was being held back pending, quote, career stabilization. What did that even mean? And who had made the decision to delay my access to money that was legally mine? The two men finished their coffee and left shortly after, taking their devastating revelations with them. I sat there for another hour, staring at my laptop screen without seeing it, trying to process what I'd just learned. My sister's success, the success she'd used to humiliate me for years, was built on a foundation of family money that I'd been excluded from accessing. That evening, I called my parents' house, trying to sound casual despite the fury building in my chest. "Hi, Mom," I said when Solara answered. "I was wondering if we could talk about my finances, maybe some planning for the future." "Oh, Caden, I'm glad you're finally thinking practically about these things," she replied, her tone brightening. "Your father and I have been hoping you'd start taking a more mature approach to your career. Actually, I was wondering about college funds, or maybe family investments. Did you and Dad set up any kind of educational trust for me and Irixie when we were younger?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Too long. "Well," she said finally, "there are some family financial arrangements, but those are quite complicated, dear. Nothing you need to worry about right now while you're still figuring out your career path." "But Irixie had access to family money to start her real estate business, didn't she?" Another pause, even longer this time. "Irixie has always been very focused and mature about her professional goals," my mother said carefully. "Your father and I felt comfortable supporting her ambitions because she had a clear business plan and demonstrated responsibility." The implication was clear. They didn't think I was mature or responsible enough to access money that was legally mine, money they'd given to Irixie while telling me I was worthless trash who would never amount to anything. "I see," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "And what would I need to do to demonstrate the same level of maturity and responsibility?" "Oh, Caden, let's not worry about these complicated financial matters right now. Focus on building your career first, and we can discuss other opportunities later." I hung up the phone, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Not only had my family systematically undermined my confidence and dismissed my ambitions, but they'd also withheld financial resources that could have made those ambitions possible, while simultaneously funding my sister's competing career. But as I sat there in my tiny apartment, surrounded by my computers and my code, something crystallized in my mind. They thought I needed their permission to succeed. They thought I needed their money, their approval, their validation. They were wrong. I had something they didn't understand, something they'd consistently undervalued. The ability to build something from nothing using nothing but intelligence, creativity, and determination. Over the next few weeks, I dove into my work with a focus and intensity I'd never experienced before. Every line of code I wrote, every algorithm I refined, every system I optimized was powered by a quiet, burning rage at the injustice of what I'd discovered. But I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I did what I do best. I investigated. The coffee shop revelation was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, I transformed from a naive young programmer into something resembling a forensic accountant, methodically uncovering the full scope of my family's financial deception. What I found was far more extensive and calculated than I'd initially imagined. My first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: public records. In Washington state, many business filings and property transactions are matters of public record, available to anyone who knows where to look. I spent countless evenings at the Seattle Public Library, digging through databases and cross-referencing corporate documents. Owen Trellis Automotive Holdings wasn't just a chain of car dealerships. It was the hub of a complex web of LLCs, business partnerships, and investment vehicles that spanned multiple states. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated the structure appeared. There were property management companies, investment funds, and even a consulting firm that seemed to exist primarily to move money between the various entities. But the most interesting discovery was Grenthal Family Trust, named after my mother's maiden name. Incorporated in Delaware 12 years earlier, this trust was the actual owner of the funds that had been promised to Irixie and me. According to the corporate filings, the trust was managed by a board of 3 trustees: my father Owen, my mother Solara, and surprisingly, my grandmother Lunara. I drove to Bellevue that Saturday morning, ostensibly to visit my grandmother for lunch, but actually to see if I could learn more about the trust arrangement. Lunara lived in the same Tudor mansion where our family had gathered for holidays throughout my childhood, a sprawling estate that I now realized was probably owned by one of the family LLCs rather than by her directly. Grandmother had always been fond of me, perhaps because I reminded her of her late husband, who had been something of an inventor and tinkerer himself. She welcomed me warmly, as she always did, and we settled into her sunroom for tea and sandwiches. "Grandmother," I said carefully, "I've been thinking about my future financial planning, and I was wondering if you could help me understand some of the family's investment strategies." She set down her teacup and studied me with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "What specifically are you curious about, dear?" "Well, I know that you and my parents set up some kind of educational trust for Irixie and me when we were younger. I was wondering how that works, what the requirements are for accessing those funds." Lunara's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. There was surprise there, and something that might have been disapproval. "Who told you about the trust arrangements?" she asked. "I overheard some businessmen discussing Dad's company sale, and they mentioned trust funds for both Irixie and me, but when I asked Mom about it, she was very vague." My grandmother was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea slowly as she considered how to respond. Finally, she set down her spoon and looked at me directly. "Caden, the trust was established with the best of intentions. Your grandfather and I wanted to ensure that you and your sister would have resources to pursue your goals after college. Each fund was initially seeded with $2 million and has been growing steadily through conservative investments. But Irixie has been accessing her fund for years, hasn't she? That's how she was able to get started in real estate so quickly." Another long pause. "Yes, your sister petitioned the trustees for early access when she turned 25. She presented a comprehensive business plan for her real estate ventures, demonstrated her commitment to building a sustainable career, and showed that she had the maturity to handle significant financial resources responsibly." "And what about my fund?" Lunara sighed deeply. "Your parents felt that you needed more time to develop focus and practical goals before accessing such substantial resources. They were concerned that giving you immediate access to millions of dollars might discourage you from developing discipline and work ethic." The euphemistic language was maddening. What she was really saying was that my parents had decided I was too immature and unfocused to be trusted with my own money, while simultaneously using that decision as evidence that I was immature and unfocused. "Grandmother," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I'm 23 years old. I have a college degree and a job. What exactly would I need to demonstrate to prove that I'm ready for the same level of trust that Irixie received?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something that chilled me. She looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. "The truth is, Caden, your parents have concerns about your judgment and your priorities. They worry that you might waste the money on impractical business ventures or risky investments. They want to see you establish a stable career first." "A stable career like working in tech support and living paycheck to paycheck?" "They want to see you commit to something practical and achievable rather than chasing entrepreneurial fantasies." There it was. The real reason I'd been excluded from resources that were legally mine. My family had decided that my ambitions were fantasies, that my skills and ideas were worthless, and that the best thing they could do for me was to withhold the financial resources that might enable me to prove them wrong. I finished lunch with my grandmother, maintaining polite conversation while my mind raced with the implications of what I'd learned. On the drive home, I stopped at an internet cafe and spent 2 hours researching Delaware trust law, beneficiary rights, and legal precedents for trust disputes. What I discovered was both encouraging and infuriating. As a named beneficiary of the trust, I had certain legal rights to information about the trust's assets, performance, and management decisions. The trustees had a fiduciary duty to act in my best interests, not based on their personal opinions about my career choices. Most importantly, there were legal mechanisms for challenging trustee decisions that seemed arbitrary or discriminatory. But I also learned that trust litigation could be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to family relationships. Even if I won, the process might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and take years to resolve. Over the following weeks, I continued my investigation using more sophisticated methods. I hired a private investigator named Rodriguez, who specialized in asset searches and corporate intelligence. For $1,500, money I scraped together by selling my gaming console and some old textbooks, he provided me with a comprehensive report on my family's financial structure. The report was eye-opening. The Marvik family assets were far more extensive than I'd realized. Beyond the dealership business and the family trust, there were real estate investments, stock portfolios, and business interests that totaled well over $70 million. My parents weren't just comfortably wealthy, they were legitimately rich. But the most damaging discovery was in the trust documents themselves. Rodriguez had managed to obtain copies of the original trust agreement and all subsequent amendments. What I found there made me sick to my stomach. The original trust, established when Irixie and I were both minors, gave us equal access to our respective funds upon reaching age 21 or upon college graduation, whichever came later. There were no provisions for delayed access based on, quote, career stabilization or trustee assessment of our maturity. Those restrictions had been added through amendments to the trust that were executed after Irixie had already received her distributions. In other words, after my sister had gotten her money, my parents had changed the rules to prevent me from getting mine. The amendments were dated just 3 months after my college graduation dinner, right around the time Irixie had made her cruel speech about me being worthless trash. The timing couldn't have been coincidental, but even more damaging was a series of emails between my parents and the trust attorney that Rodriguez had uncovered through discovery requests related to the business sale. In these emails, my father explicitly stated that he wanted to motivate Caden to abandon his unrealistic entrepreneurial fantasies, and that withholding access to the trust funds was the best way to force him into a practical career path. My mother had replied to one email saying, "We need to help Caden understand that real success requires discipline and focus, not wild dreams about becoming the next tech mogul. Keeping him financially dependent will teach him the value of steady employment." They hadn't just excluded me from my inheritance, they had weaponized it as a tool to manipulate my life choices and undermine my confidence. The money that should have been helping me build the future I dreamed of was instead being used to force me to abandon those dreams entirely. As I read through these documents in my apartment that night, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion that had dominated my emotions for months crystallized into something much more powerful. Absolute determination. They thought they were teaching me about the real world. They thought they were forcing me to grow up and be practical. Instead, they had taught me that I couldn't trust them, couldn't depend on them, and couldn't wait for their permission to build the life I wanted. I had something they'd consistently underestimated, the ability to succeed without them. And I was about to prove it. The evidence I'd gathered over those months of investigation gave me clarity about my family's betrayal, but it also crystallized something much more important. My absolute determination to succeed without their money, their approval, or their permission. If they wanted to withhold my inheritance while building my sister's empire, I would build something so successful that their petty manipulations would become irrelevant. But I needed a plan that went far beyond just creating a profitable business. I needed to build something that would definitively prove their assessment of me wrong, something that would generate the kind of wealth that would make their trust fund games look like pocket change. Most importantly, I wanted to do it in a way that would culminate in the perfect symbolic victory. The plan that emerged over the next several weeks was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. First, I would focus all of my energy and resources on developing my logistics optimization platform into a product that could revolutionize supply chain management across multiple industries. The preliminary work I'd done indicated that the technology could save large companies millions of dollars annually in shipping costs and inventory management. If I could prove the concept with a few major clients, the scalability would be enormous. Second, I would do it completely independently, without any family money or connections. Every dollar invested would come from my own earnings or from outside investors who believed in the technology rather than my family name. This wasn't just about proving my capabilities. It was about ensuring that when I succeeded, no one could claim that family resources had enabled my success. Third, and most importantly, I would document everything, every milestone, every client meeting, every technical breakthrough, every financial projection. When the time came to reveal what I'd built, I wanted there to be absolutely no ambiguity about the timeline or the source of my success. The first step was quitting my technical support job and dedicating myself full-time to product development. This was terrifying from a financial perspective, since I had almost no savings and rent was due every month, but I realized that playing it safe was actually the riskiest strategy available to me. If I stayed in the comfortable mediocrity of my day job, I'd never build anything significant enough to change my circumstances. I negotiated a consulting arrangement with my former employer that allowed me to work part-time, handling their most complex technical problems on a project basis. This gave me enough income to cover basic expenses while freeing up 30 hours a week to focus on my own software development. My studio apartment became a war room. I rearranged the entire space to optimize for productivity, creating separate zones for coding, testing, client communications, and strategic planning. I installed a whiteboard that covered an entire wall, where I mapped out development timelines, client acquisition strategies, and financial projections. The core technology I was developing used machine learning algorithms to analyze shipping patterns, inventory turnover rates, and seasonal demand fluctuations to optimize supply chain operations. But the real innovation was in the user interface design and the integration capabilities that would allow companies to implement the system without disrupting their existing workflows. To validate the concept, I reached out to 3 local companies that I knew had complex logistics challenges. Martinez Distribution was a regional food service company that delivered to restaurants across 5 states. They were spending over $2 million annually on shipping and warehousing, but they had no systematic way to optimize their routes or inventory levels. I offered to do a free analysis of their current operations using my algorithms, with no obligation for them to purchase anything. The results were stunning. My system identified potential cost savings of over $400,000 per year through optimized routing, better inventory management, and more efficient warehouse operations. The owner, Elena Martinez, was impressed enough to agree to a 3-month pilot program. She paid me $15,000 to implement a limited version of my system for their Northwest operations, with the agreement that if it delivered the promised savings, they would pay for a full implementation and provide a reference for other potential clients. Within 6 weeks, Martinez Distribution was seeing measurable improvements in their efficiency metrics. Delivery times were down by an average of 12%, inventory carrying costs had dropped by 8%, and customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the company's history. But the real breakthrough came when Elena mentioned the pilot program to one of her clients, a national restaurant chain called Pacific Grill that was struggling with supply chain inefficiencies across their 240 locations. They asked Elena to introduce them to the developer of the system that was saving her so much money. The meeting with Pacific Grill's operations team was the moment I knew I had something genuinely revolutionary. Their logistics challenges were exponentially more complex than anything Martinez Distribution was dealing with, but my algorithms were able to identify potential savings of over $12 million annually across their network. They offered me a contract worth $200,000 to implement a pilot program across their West Coast locations, with performance bonuses that could double that amount if the system delivered the promised results. More importantly, they agreed to serve as a reference client for other national chains if the pilot was successful. I was facing a problem I hadn't anticipated. I needed to scale my operations rapidly to handle clients of this size and complexity. I needed additional developers, specialized hardware, and professional services support that were far beyond what I could provide working alone from my studio apartment. This is where I made the decision that would ultimately determine whether my plan succeeded or failed. Instead of trying to bootstrap the growth with my limited resources, I decided to seek outside investment from venture capital firms that specialized in enterprise software companies. I spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive business plan that included detailed financial projections, technical specifications, competitive analysis, and market research. The document was 47 pages long and represented everything I'd learned about the logistics industry, and the potential applications of my technology. The first venture capital firm I pitched was Cascade Ventures, a Seattle-based fund that had successfully invested in several enterprise software startups. I had no warm introduction, no family connections, no prestigious business school credentials. I simply called their office and asked for 10 minutes to explain why they should consider investing in my company. To my surprise, they agreed to meet with me the following week. The presentation I gave in their conference room was the most important 20 minutes of my life up to that point. I demonstrated the technology using real data from Martinez Distribution and Pacific Grill, showed the financial projections for scaling to national accounts, and explained how the recurring revenue model would generate sustainable long-term growth. 2 weeks later, Cascade Ventures offered me $1.2 million in Series A funding in exchange for 25% equity in my company, which I had named Optimal Systems. The valuation implied that my 4 years of code development and 6 months of client acquisition had created a company worth nearly $5 million. But I turned down their offer, not because the terms were unfavorable, but because I had realized that the logistics optimization technology was just the beginning. With the right strategy and execution, I could build something much larger and more valuable than a specialized software company. I could create a platform that revolutionized how businesses approached supply chain management, inventory optimization, and operational efficiency across multiple industries. I countered with a request for $3 million in funding at a $15 million valuation, which would give them 20% equity while allowing me to maintain control of the company's strategic direction. I also negotiated performance milestones that would release the funding in tranches based on revenue growth and client acquisition targets. After a week of negotiations, they accepted my counteroffer. The day I signed the investment agreement, I moved out of my studio apartment and into a proper office space in the South Lake Union District. I hired 3 experienced developers, a business development manager, and a chief technology officer who had previously worked at Amazon and Microsoft. Within 6 months, Optimal Systems had 12 enterprise clients generating over $4 million in annual recurring revenue. The technology that my family had dismissed as playing with computer games was now saving companies tens of millions of dollars and generating the kind of growth that attracted attention from major technology companies and private equity firms. But I wasn't ready to sell yet. I was just getting started. Over the next 2 years, I reinvested every dollar of profit back into product development and market expansion. We added artificial intelligence capabilities, predictive analytics, and integration with major enterprise resource planning systems. The platform evolved from a logistics optimization tool into a comprehensive operational intelligence system that could analyze and optimize nearly every aspect of how large companies manage their resources. By year 3, Optimal Systems was generating $40 million in annual revenue, with over 60 enterprise clients, including 3 Fortune 100 companies. Venture capital firms were calling me weekly, with offers to lead Series B and Series C funding rounds that would value the company at over $200 million. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of taking another round of outside investment, I decided to pursue acquisition offers from the major technology companies that had been circling for months. The bidding war that ensued exceeded my wildest expectations. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle all submitted offers to acquire Optimal Systems, with the final winning bid coming from a consortium led by Microsoft for $2.8 billion in cash and stock. I was 26 years old, and I had just become a billionaire. But the plan I'd been developing over those years wasn't complete yet. The final phase required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a level of strategic patience that would make the previous years of preparation seem simple by comparison. Because I wasn't just planning to become successful. I was planning to buy the exact symbol of success that my sister had been coveting her entire adult life, and I was going to do it in a way that would demonstrate definitively who the real success story in the family had always been. The Microsoft acquisition closed on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in the conference room of Wilson Kempf & Associates, the law firm that had handled the transaction, watching my attorney finalize the last of the paperwork that would transfer ownership of Optimal Systems and deposit $2.8 billion into my personal accounts. After taxes and the equity shares that went to my employees and early investors, my net worth was just over $1.9 billion. I was 26 years old, and I had just become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in American history. But I felt strangely calm about it, almost detached. The money was never really the point. It was what the money would allow me to do next that mattered. As I walked out of that conference room and into the Seattle sunshine, I pulled out my phone and made a call I'd been planning for months. Martinez Real Estate Services, this is Elena. Elena, it's Caden Marvik from Optimal Systems. I hope you're well. Caden! Congratulations on the Microsoft deal. I saw the announcement in the Business Journal this morning. That's incredible what you built from nothing. Elena Martinez had become more than just my first client over the past 4 years. She'd evolved into something like a mentor and friend, one of the few people who had believed in my potential when everyone else saw only a delusional young programmer. I'd decided months earlier that when the acquisition closed, she would be the first person I'd call. Thank you, Elena. You took a chance on me when no one else would, and I'll never forget that. But I'm actually calling because I need your help with something personal. Of course. What can I do for you? I need you to help me buy a house, a very specific house. And I need the entire transaction to remain completely confidential until I'm ready to reveal it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, that sounds intriguing. What property are we talking about? The Whitmore Estate in Malibu. 15,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, 3 acres on the Pacific Coast Highway. It's been on and off the market for the past 2 years, currently listed at $85 million. The Whitmore Estate, Elena repeated slowly. Caden, that's one of the most exclusive properties in Southern California. The current owners are only considering cash offers from pre-qualified buyers. The listing agent is extremely selective about who they'll even show the property to. I have cash, I said simply, and I believe I'm adequately qualified. Elena laughed, but it was the laugh of someone who was beginning to understand the scope of what I was proposing. I suppose you are, but can I ask why this particular property? There are certainly other exceptional homes in that price range that might be easier to acquire. This was the moment I'd been anticipating, the moment when I would begin to reveal the deeper strategy behind everything I'd been building toward. Elena, this isn't just about buying a house. This is about buying a very specific symbol of success that someone in my family has been obsessing over for more than a decade. Someone who spent years telling me I was worthless trash who would never amount to anything, while she built her own real estate career using family money that was supposed to be mine as well. I could hear Elena processing this information. She knew me well enough by this point to understand that I didn't do anything impulsively, and that there was always a deeper strategy behind my major decisions. You want to buy your sister's dream house, she said finally. I want to buy my sister's dream house, and I want to do it in a way that makes it clear that while she was spending years humiliating me for my lack of practical success, I was building something so valuable that I can now purchase her ultimate fantasy property as easily as she might buy a cup of coffee. That's either the most brilliant strategic move I've ever heard, or it's going to create a family dynamic that makes Thanksgiving dinner very uncomfortable for the rest of your life. Probably both, I admitted, but Thanksgiving dinners have been uncomfortable for me for years anyway. At least this way. They'll be uncomfortable for the right reasons. Elena agreed to handle the transaction, and over the following weeks we began the complex process of acquiring the Whitmore Estate. The first challenge was establishing my credentials with the listing agent Pemberton & Associates, the same Beverly Hills firm where Irixie worked as one of their top agents. This presented an obvious problem. If Irixie discovered that her own firm was representing a buyer for the property she'd been trying to acquire for years, she might find a way to interfere with the transaction, or at least discover my identity before I was ready to reveal it. We needed to handle the purchase through intermediaries who could maintain absolute confidentiality. Elena connected me with Harrison & Associates, a Los Angeles-based firm that specialized in high-net-worth property acquisitions for clients who required discretion. Their typical customers were celebrities, tech executives, and foreign investors who preferred to keep their real estate transactions private for security or strategic reasons. The managing partner, Thomas Harrison, was exactly the kind of professional I needed for this type of sensitive transaction. He was accustomed to handling 9-figure purchases on behalf of clients whose identities were protected by multiple layers of corporate structures and confidentiality agreements. Mr. Marvik, he said during our first meeting at his Century City office, I understand you're interested in acquiring the Whitmore Estate on behalf of your family office. Can you tell me about the urgency of the timeline? I had established Marvik Holdings LLC as my family investment office, with Thomas listed as the authorized representative for real estate transactions. From the seller's perspective, he appeared to be representing a wealthy Seattle family's investment vehicle, with no apparent connection to anyone at Pemberton and Associates. "The timeline is flexible," I replied, "but I want to ensure that we can close quickly once the offer is accepted. This should be an all-cash transaction with no financing contingencies, no inspection period, and minimal due diligence requirements." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That type of clean offer is exactly what sellers of premier properties prefer. It eliminates uncertainty and allows for rapid closings. Based on the current market analysis, I believe an offer of $78 to $80 million would be competitive, given the property's time on market and the seller's motivation level." "I'd like to offer $85 million, I said, "the full asking price, cash, with a 10-day closing period." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Marvik, that's a very aggressive offer. You might be able to acquire the property for several $1,000,000 less with a more strategic approach." "The additional few $1,000,000 aren't material to this transaction," I explained. "What matters is ensuring that our offer is accepted immediately and that the closing process is completed before any other potential buyers have time to submit competing bids." What I didn't tell Thomas was that I had reason to believe Irixie was still working with investors to try to put together a consortium bid for the property. According to my research, she had been pursuing the Whitmore estate for over 18 months, but she was still several $1,000,000 short of being able to make a competitive offer. My strategy was to purchase the property before she could finalize her financing arrangements. The offer was submitted on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, it had been accepted. The 10-day period between acceptance and closing was the most nerve-wracking week and a half of my life. Every day I expected to receive a call from Elena or Thomas, telling me that complications had arisen, that another buyer had emerged, or that someone at Pemberton and Associates had discovered the connection between the purchaser and one of their own agents. But the transaction proceeded smoothly. The seller was a technology executive who had purchased the property 5 years earlier for $62 million, invested another $15 million in renovations and improvements, and was now relocating to Switzerland for tax reasons. He was motivated to close quickly and had no interest in entertaining multiple offers or prolonged negotiations. The closing took place at Thomas Harrison's office on a Thursday morning. I sat at the conference table with my attorney and Thomas, reviewing the final documents that would transfer ownership of the Whitmore estate to Marvik Holdings, LLC. The wire transfer of $85 million had been completed the previous afternoon, and the deed was ready to be recorded with Los Angeles County. As I signed the last document, Thomas extended his hand in congratulation. "Mr. Marvik, you are now the owner of one of the most spectacular properties in Southern California. I hope you and your family will enjoy it for many years." "Thank you, Thomas. But I should mention that we won't be taking possession immediately. I have some family business to handle first, and I want to time the announcement of this purchase very carefully." Thomas nodded. "Of course. Many of our clients prefer to maintain privacy about their acquisitions until they're ready for public disclosure. The property management company will continue maintaining the estate until you're ready to move forward." I left the closing feeling like I was carrying a loaded weapon. The deed to the Whitmore estate was in my briefcase, along with documentation proving that I had purchased the property my sister had been dreaming about since she was 20 years old. But the most delicate part of my plan was still ahead of me. The timing of the revelation had to be perfect. I needed to create a moment where the full impact of what I had achieved would be undeniable, where there could be no ambiguity about the contrast between my sister's assessment of my potential and the reality of what I had accomplished. Most importantly, I needed to do it in a way that would demonstrate not just my financial success, but the systematic deception and manipulation that my family had used to try to prevent that success. I decided to wait for the annual Marvik family reunion, scheduled for the third weekend in July at my grandmother's estate in Bellevue. This was the same gathering where Irixie had humiliated me at my college graduation dinner 4 years earlier. The same setting where I had been dismissed as a delusional failure chasing unrealistic dreams. But this year I would be returning as the secret owner of the property that represented everything my sister had been working toward her entire adult life. And I would be revealing that achievement in a way that would force my entire family to confront not just their misjudgment of my potential, but their active efforts to sabotage my success. I spent the next 3 months preparing for that confrontation with the same methodical attention to detail that I had applied to building optimal systems. Every element of my presentation was planned. Every document was organized. Every potential response was anticipated. Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. This was about revealing the truth about what they had done, and ensuring that the consequences of their actions would be as permanent and undeniable as the success they had tried so hard to prevent. The third Saturday in July arrived with the kind of perfect Seattle weather that makes people forget about the 9 months of gray skies and rain. I pulled my Tesla Model S into the circular driveway of my grandmother's Bellevue estate at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 30 minutes after the family reunion was scheduled to begin. The timing was intentional. I wanted everyone to be settled and comfortable before I disrupted their carefully constructed version of reality. The Tudor mansion looked exactly as it had during every family gathering of my youth, with its manicured gardens, fountain centerpiece, and that imposing facade that had always made me feel small and unwelcome. But today, as I walked up the stone pathway carrying my leather briefcase, I felt something I'd never experienced in this place: absolute confidence. Through the tall windows I could see the familiar scene playing out in the grand living room. Irixie held court near the marble fireplace, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she gestured animatedly with a crystal champagne flute. She was wearing what looked like a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she had that radiant glow that successful people develop when they're accustomed to being the center of attention. The extended family had assembled in their usual formation. Uncle Daryl and his wife occupied the leather sofa, nodding approvingly at whatever story Irixie was telling. Cousin Jonas leaned against the built-in bookshelf with his characteristic smirk, while Aunt Celine sat in the wingback chair that had been grandfather's favorite spot, surveying the room like a benevolent monarch. My parents stood near the bay windows that overlooked the rose garden, my father resplendent in his weekend uniform of polo shirt and pressed khakis, my mother elegant as always in her pearls and cashmere cardigan. They looked prosperous and content, surrounded by their successful offspring and accomplished relatives. I paused at the front door, taking one last moment to appreciate the irony of the situation. In a few minutes, everything they believed about themselves, about me, and about the natural order of success in our family would be permanently altered. There would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that had sustained them for years. I rang the doorbell. Grandmother Lunara answered, as she always did, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure when she saw me. Despite everything that had happened with the trust fund situation, she had never treated me with anything but kindness and respect. "Caden, darling, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. Everyone's in the living room, and we were just about to toast some exciting news from Irixie." Perfect timing, I thought as I followed her through the foyer. I could hear my sister's voice carrying from the living room, animated and triumphant. "The consortium is finally coming together," she was saying as we entered the room. "We've secured commitments from 3 major investors, and my business partner has lined up bridge financing for the remainder. By Labor Day, I should be in a position to make a formal offer on the Whitmore estate." The family murmured appreciatively. Someone asked about the purchase price, and Irixie launched into her well-rehearsed explanation of the property's value, its investment potential, and the strategic importance of establishing herself as a player in the ultra-luxury Malibu market. $85 million is steep, she acknowledged, but when you consider the location, the architectural significance, and the potential for appreciation, it's actually undervalued. Properties like this come on the market maybe once every decade. This is my chance to establish myself not just as a successful agent, but as a principal investor in trophy real estate. I stood quietly in the doorway, unnoticed by everyone except grandmother, who had moved to the kitchen to prepare refreshments. The scene was perfect. Irixie was at the peak of her confidence, surrounded by an audience that hung on her every word, describing her imminent acquisition of the property that represented the pinnacle of her ambitions. "Caden," my father called out when he finally noticed me. "There you are, come join us." Irixie was just telling us about her plans for the Whitmore estate. All eyes turned to me as I walked into the center of the room. I set my briefcase down on the coffee table and smiled politely at the assembled family. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and conversational, "I'd love to hear more about Irixie's plans for the property. It sounds like a fascinating investment opportunity." Irixie beamed, clearly pleased to have a new audience member for her presentation. "Oh, Caden, you'd love this place. It's everything I've been working toward for the past 10 years. 15,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, infinity pool, wine cellar, 3 acres of oceanfront gardens. It's not just a house, it's a statement about what's possible when you commit yourself to excellence." "It certainly sounds impressive," I replied. And you think you'll be able to close on the purchase by Labor Day? That's the plan, she said confidently. It's been a complex negotiation because of the financing structure, but we're very close to finalizing everything. This will be the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. I nodded thoughtfully. Irixie, I'm curious about something. You've been talking about this property for so long, describing it in such detail. Have you actually been inside the house? Have you had a chance to see it in person? She hesitated for just a moment, and I caught a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty in her eyes. Well, not yet. The current owners have been very selective about showings, and my consortium partners want to have our financing completely locked down before we request a formal tour. But I've studied every photograph, every architectural detail, every square foot of the floor plans. I know that house better than some people know their own homes. That's fascinating, I said, reaching for my briefcase, because I actually have some photographs of the property that you might be interested in seeing. Very recent photographs. I opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder containing dozens of high-resolution images that Thomas Harrison had commissioned during the closing process. But these weren't the same marketing photos that had been published in Architectural Digest. These were detailed documentation photographs that showed every room, every view, every architectural feature from multiple angles. These are beautiful, Irixie said as I handed her the folder, though there was a puzzled expression on her face. Where did you get these? These definitely aren't from the original listing materials. You're right, I agreed. These were taken last week by a professional photographer. I commissioned them because I wanted to have complete documentation of every aspect of the property. The room was quiet now. Everyone was watching our conversation with growing curiosity, trying to understand why I would have commissioned professional photography of a house that Irixie was planning to purchase. Caden, my mother said slowly, why would you hire a photographer to document the Whitmore estate? I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out a second folder, this one containing the deed, closing documents, and title insurance policy that proved my ownership of the property. Because, I said, setting the documents on the coffee table where everyone could see them, I wanted to have a complete record of my new house. The silence that followed was so profound that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant sound of a lawnmower from a neighboring property, even the soft whisper of the air conditioning system cycling on. Irixie stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Your new house? She repeated. I closed on the purchase of the Whitmore estate 6 weeks ago, I explained matter-of-factly. All cash, $85 million, no financing contingencies. The transaction was handled through intermediaries to maintain privacy, but I am now the sole owner of the property. My father was the first to find his voice. Caden, what are you talking about? You can't possibly have purchased an $85 million house. You work in tech support. I smiled at that, remembering all the times over the years when my family had reduced my entire identity to that single dismissive phrase. Actually, Dad, I haven't worked in tech support for quite some time. 4 years ago, I founded a software company called Optimal Systems. 3 months ago, I sold that company to Microsoft for $2.8 billion. The number landed in the room like a physical blow. I watched as each family member processed what I had just said, their faces cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning comprehension. That's impossible, Irixie said flatly. You're living in that tiny apartment, driving an old Honda, working part-time jobs. You don't have billions of dollars. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen so that everyone in the room could see the account balance. The number was so large that it took up multiple lines on the display. $1, $847, $293, $448.77. I moved out of the apartment 2 years ago, I explained patiently. I've been living in a penthouse in South Lake Union while I built my company. And I traded in the Honda for a Tesla, though I suppose you wouldn't have known that since none of you have visited me or shown any interest in my life for the past several years. Cousin Jonas stepped closer to examine the documents on the coffee table. As a lawyer, he understood immediately what he was looking at. These are legitimate, he said quietly. This is a recorded deed showing ownership transfer of the Whitmore estate to Marvik Holdings LLC, with Caden listed as the sole member and manager of the LLC. But how? My mother whispered. How did you build a company worth billions of dollars without us knowing about it? This was the moment I had been preparing for, the opportunity to reveal not just my success, but the systematic way they had tried to prevent it. I opened my briefcase one final time and pulled out the folder containing all of the evidence I had gathered about the trust fund manipulation, the emails between my parents and their attorney, and the documentation proving how they had changed the terms of my inheritance after giving Irixie access to hers. "That's an interesting question, Mom," I said, distributing copies of the documents to each family member. "Because while I was building optimal systems from nothing, living on ramen noodles, and working 18-hour days to prove that my ideas had value, you were actively working to ensure that I wouldn't have access to the same family resources that you provided to Irixie." I watched their faces as they read through the evidence. The emails were particularly damaging, showing their explicit strategy to use financial pressure to force me to abandon my entrepreneurial ambitions. "You didn't just dismiss my dreams as unrealistic," I continued. "You weaponized my inheritance against me, using money that was legally mine as a tool to manipulate my life choices. You thought that keeping me financially desperate would teach me to be practical and force me to get what you considered a real job." Uncle Darrell looked up from the documents with an expression of genuine shock. "Owen, Solara, is this true? Did you really prevent Caden from accessing his trust fund while allowing Irixie to use hers to build her business?" My father's face had gone pale. "We thought we were helping him develop discipline and realistic expectations." "You thought you were teaching me my place," I corrected. "Just like at my graduation dinner 4 years ago, when Irixie called me worthless trash in front of the entire family, and not one of you disagreed with her assessment." I turned to face my sister directly. "Irixie, you've spent the last decade building your real estate career using family money, family connections, and a trust fund that gave you a multi-million-dollar head start. You used that advantage to position yourself as the family success story while dismissing me as a delusional failure." She was staring at the property photographs with something like horror, as if she was finally understanding the full scope of what had just been revealed. "But here's what you never understood," I continued. "While you were spending years telling me that I'd never amount to anything, I was building something so valuable that I can now purchase your ultimate dream property as easily as you might buy a cup of coffee. The house you've been obsessing over for a decade, the property you've been planning and saving and scheming to acquire, belongs to me now." The room was completely silent except for the sound of pages rustling as various family members continued to examine the evidence of both my success and their deception. "Caden," Grandmother Lunara said softly from the kitchen doorway, where she had been listening to the entire conversation, "I need to apologize to you. I was one of the trustees who agreed to delay your access to the family trust. We thought we were protecting you from making impulsive decisions, but we were wrong. We were terribly, horribly wrong." I looked at her with genuine affection. She was the only person in the room who had never treated me with cruelty or dismissal, even when she had made decisions I disagreed with. "Grandmother, I understand why you thought you were helping, but the rest of them weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to control me, to force me into a version of success that looked like what they understood and valued." I closed my briefcase and picked it up, preparing to leave. I didn't come here today to humiliate anyone or to gloat about my success. I came to tell you the truth about what really happened, and to let you know that the dynamic in this family has changed permanently. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to address Irixie one final time. "By the way, you're welcome to tour the Whitmore estate anytime you'd like. I think you'd find it even more spectacular than the photographs suggest. Just call my assistant and she'll arrange a showing." As I reached the front door, I heard my mother call out behind me, "Caden, wait, please, can't we talk about this?" I turned around one last time to face the family that had spent years convincing me I was worthless, while actively working to prevent me from proving them wrong. "Mom," I said quietly, "I spent 26 years waiting for you to see me as something other than a disappointment. I'm done waiting." And with that, I walked out of my grandmother's house and into the afternoon sunshine, leaving behind the people who had tried so hard to keep me small that they never noticed when I became something extraordinary. The sound of the front door closing behind me felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. 6 months after the confrontation at my grandmother's estate, I was standing on the infinity pool deck of the Whitmore estate, watching the Pacific sunset paint the Malibu coastline in shades of gold and crimson. The house had been everything the photographs promised and more, a masterpiece of architecture and design that represented not just luxury, but the fulfillment of dreams I'd been told were impossible. But the most satisfying aspect of owning the property wasn't the spectacular views or the world-class amenities. It was the knowledge that every morning when I woke up in the master suite, I was living proof that their assessment of me had been catastrophically wrong. The immediate aftermath of my revelation had unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Within hours of leaving the family reunion, my phone had started ringing with calls from various relatives, each wanting to apologize, explain, or somehow repair the damage that had been exposed. I didn't answer any of them. My parents left voicemails that cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and eventually something approaching remorse. Irixie sent text messages that ranged from accusations that I had somehow cheated or received unfair advantages to desperate pleas for forgiveness and offers to work together on future investments. But the call that mattered came 3 weeks later from my grandmother Lunara. "Caden," she said when I finally answered, "I've been thinking about what happened, about what we did to you, and I need you to know that there's no excuse for it. We were wrong, and I'm deeply ashamed of my part in preventing you from accessing your inheritance." Unlike the others, she didn't make excuses or try to minimize the impact of their actions. She simply acknowledged the truth and accepted responsibility for her role in it. "I know you probably don't want to see any of us right now," she continued, "but I was hoping you might consider having lunch with me sometime. Not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but because I'd like to understand what you built and how you did it. I think I'd like to learn from my youngest grandson." 2 months later, I did have lunch with her at her favorite restaurant in downtown Bellevue. For 2 hours, I explained the technical details of machine learning algorithms, the challenges of scaling enterprise software, and the strategic decisions that had led to the Microsoft acquisition. She listened with genuine fascination, asking thoughtful questions and displaying the sharp intelligence that had helped her build her own business empire decades earlier. As we were leaving the restaurant, she handed me a small wrapped package. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. "He always believed that the most important thing you could build was something that helped other people solve their problems. I think he would have been very proud of what you accomplished." Inside was his vintage compass, the same one he'd used during his years as a civil engineer, engraved with a simple inscription, "True North never changes." The gift inspired the next phase of my life. I established the Marvik Foundation, dedicating $200 million to providing venture capital funding and mentorship for entrepreneurs who were building technology companies that could create positive social impact. The foundation's mission was simple: to ensure that brilliant ideas weren't dismissed simply because they came from people who didn't fit traditional expectations of success. Our first investment was in a young woman from Detroit who had developed an AI platform for optimizing urban transportation systems. She reminded me of myself at 23, brilliant, determined, and completely underestimated by everyone around her. Within 18 months, her company was saving cities millions of dollars in infrastructure costs and reducing traffic congestion by double-digit percentages. The Marvik Foundation quickly became known in Silicon Valley as the place where unconventional entrepreneurs could find support for revolutionary ideas. We funded technologies that addressed climate change, poverty, healthcare access, and educational inequality. Each successful company we supported was proof that innovation comes from unexpected places when you give talented people the resources they need to build their vision. As for my relationship with my family, it eventually found a new equilibrium based on mutual respect rather than the old patterns of dismissal and control. My parents and I have dinner occasionally, conversations that are polite but distant. They seem genuinely proud of what I've accomplished, though I suspect they still don't fully understand how I did it. Irixie and I maintain a cordial but limited relationship. She never did acquire a trophy property like the Whitmore estate, though her real estate career continues to be successful by most people's standards. Sometimes I catch her looking at me during family gatherings with an expression I can't quite read. Perhaps regret, perhaps wonder, perhaps just the discomfort of someone who has had to completely revise their understanding of the world. But the real transformation was internal. I no longer need their validation or approval to feel worthy of success. I no longer define myself in opposition to their expectations, or as a reaction to their dismissal. I simply am who I am, someone who builds things that matter, who helps others achieve their potential, and who never forgot what it felt like to be underestimated. Sometimes, when I'm working late in my home office overlooking the Pacific, I remember that graduation dinner 4 years ago when Irixie called me worthless trash. The memory doesn't sting anymore. Instead, it serves as a reminder of how far I've traveled and how much I've grown. They tried to teach me my place in their world. Instead, they taught me to build my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.